Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, page 101, title chapter, Settlement of the 90s. Now, 10 years before the town of Madeline came on the scene, the little cove on the extreme northwest end of the plains began to be taken up by settlers. The group of pioneers who lived there began to call their settlement Madeline, even though there was no town as such. The area had been a favored spot of cattlemen for years. John Williams, George Bailey, and John D. Flournoy of Likely had built a reservoir at the extreme north end, just below where the Pinos lived. Williams had surveyed out a few ditches, and water from the dam was used to irrigate the ground to the south, thus raising twice the stock feed. Now homesteaders were beginning to take up the land. Next chapter, titled Morton. Barney Morton was the first coming in 1892. He was a 29-year-old farmer from Illinois. The east end of the 160 was just a quarter of a mile due south of the Bailey, Flournoy, and Williams Reservoir. He built a nice two-story house about a half a mile below the dam, just to the west of the natural channel where the water came down from the reservoir. One day the 40 acres where his house stood would belong to Wilson Bailey. The remaining 120 acres would become the town of Madeline. Next chapter, titled Pinkston. Ed Pinkston was a horsebreaker and a buckaroo who came up from Chico with John Williams. He had worked all over the country breaking horses for Williams, George Bailey, and Elmer Van Loan. But along just a few years before the turn of the century, he decided to take up a piece of ground and became a farmer on 160 acres that bordered the Morton property on the south and west. Pinkston lasted just long enough to prove up on his homestead. Then he sold out and went back to doing what he knew best, riding horses. Next chapter, titled Stinson. The Stinsons were another family that started to settle at Madeline in the 90s. But then the mother died, and the father packed up and left with his children. The oldest boy, who was about 12, however, refused to go. He liked the area and his friends there, and had no intentions of leaving. A day's travel out of Madeline, he managed to sneak away from his father and lay low until the senior Stinson had given up looking for him. He walked back to Madeline, and upon seeing that he had no intentions of leaving, Elmer and Ollie Van Loan took him in and finished raising him. Arad Leray Stinson, better known as Ray, became one of the prominent young men of Madeline. Next chapter, titled Triplet. Abraham Lincoln Triplet came to Madeline in 1894, but did not file on his piece of land until the following year. Abe was 26 in 1894, and in stature was comparable to his namesake. He stood 6 feet 3.5 inches tall, and had been a sparring partner for the world's heavyweight champion boxer, Bob Fitzmans, in 1890. His younger brother, Frank, who also stood well over 6 feet tall, came to Madeline too, but did not stay long. Now Abe married Mary Holbrook of Dry Valley in 1895, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl, before leaving the plains. One day in July, when the little boy Irvin was 4 years old, he got a hold of some matches. He climbed up a ladder that was against his father's haystack and began lighting them. A roaring fire was soon going in the hay. Little Irving, in his fight, rolled off the side of the stack and fell 10 feet into a deep manger. He could not get out, but his cries soon attracted his parents. When they pulled him out of the inferno, he had several serious burns, but being young and healthy, he soon healed. His father had a rather serious financial loss, however. He lost 2 haystacks and a barn full of hay, all of his harnesses and wagons, and some farm equipment. He too pulled through, however, and continued to build and improve his farm. Next chapter, titled Bailey. Next to come to Madeline were Wilson and May Bailey. They came in 1896. They had lived for a little over a year in West Valley after their marriage. They both filed on 160, a 160-acre homestead. Wilson was 3/4 of a mile due south of the Bailey, Fillmore, and Williams Reservoir, and May's homestead took in the dam. From that point on, water could not come out of the reservoir without running for at least a half a mile across Bailey's property. Wilson bought 40 acres to the east and Barney's Morton's homestead from Morton on March 4th, 1899. It was the part of the Morton tract with Bailey's big 2-story house on it. Wilson and May and their 2 daughters, Fred and Noreen, moved into it from the house they had been living in. Morton's house, however, was sitting on low ground near the original water channel coming down from the reservoir. Wilson had intentions of irrigating that ground, so 2 years later he jacked it up and put it on skids. Then, with 6 horses, he pulled it southeast across the slough and set it on a foundation on higher ground. Wilson, Bailey, like his uncle George, was an innovator. He was the first person on the Madeline Plains to own a phonograph. He received a new gramophone on the mail stage in February of 1900. Elmer Van Loan did not get his until March. 2 years later in the spring, Wilson Bailey and his father-in-law John Williams built a telephone line between their 2 places, the first on the plains. Next chapter, titled Lansdale. Minor K. Lansdale, better known as Hank, came to Madeline in 1899. He had been around the plains since '94, however. He took up a place that bordered Bailey's on the west. Hank built himself a cabin to live in, but he lost it only a few years afterwards. He was 40 years old in '99 and was a confirmed bachelor, but then he eventually decided to change his status on life. He ordered up a bride from some, quote, mail-order marriage outfit, unquote. When he received word that she was on her way, he went about busily cleaning up his cabin. He tore all the old dirty newspapers off the walls that he had been using to serve as wallpaper. In application of the new flower-printed paper he was going to put up for her. As he tore it off the walls, he stuffed it in the fire in his pot-bellied heating stove. But before he knew it, the stove was glowing red, and so was his roof. After the fire, poor old Hank didn't even have a house for his new bride. The town of Madeline was going strong by then, however, and the newlyweds moved into one of the houses in town. Next title, Kaufman. Tom Kaufman came to the plains in the late '90s. He filed on a piece bordering Triplet Place on the east in the latter part of 1899. Tom was a bachelor too, but he was young and handsome. He was only at Madeline for about 5 years when he won the heart of Eppa Williams, and they were married. Tom was a freighter. He did not own an outfit of his own, but he was a skilled jerkline skinner who worked for various owners of the big freight outfits. He hauled freight for several years with the long-line teams. Then when the railroad came to the plains, he went to Reno for a year and learned how to operate a locomotive. After that, he hauled freight with iron horses between Reno and points north. When he was studying to be an engineer, he came and ran an engine off of a spur in the town of Madeline and tipped it over. That was just before he and Eppa were married. Anyone said he was so busy looking forwardly off toward the Williams ranch that he did not notice the end of the tracks coming toward him. Dode and Lanny. This is the next chapter. The Real Rough Riders. The commencement of the Spanish-American War in 1898 saw an upsurge in the sale of horses on the Madeline Plains, cavalry horses, that is. Everybody owned horses, and everybody got in on the booming market. The only requirement the Army made was that the animals had to be an exact number of hands high and weight within a certain range. Above and beyond that, they had to be ridden once, and that is all that was required for a sale. An Army representative was sent out to all the ranchers around the Madeline Plains contracted to deliver a certain number of horses. Then they all dropped whatever they were doing and went out to gather them in, beginning one of the biggest concentrated horse roundups the plains had ever seen. Horses were brought into various gathering sites, and the ones that fit the Army specifications were cut out. Wild, mean, and undesirable as they may have been, all the ranchers had to do was meet the specifications. Why should he sell something he could use himself? As far as that requirement of riding the horse was, there was a couple of young bronc tamers on the plains who came to ride anything that anybody could get into a corral. It was these exact two men that the Army had hired to do the topping off. Dora Smith of Smith Flat on the north side of the Sage Hen, who did not like his name and went by Dode, was one of them. Orlando Long of Red Rock, who went by the name of Lanny, was the other. No two greater bronc busters ever lived, but they earned their money on this deal. When the horses arrived at the shipping point in Amity after being driven there from the plains, it was these two boys' job to sit astride of each one of them until he gave up a bucking. Almost all of them had to be roped and thrown down before a saddle could be put on. Then, when they came up, rider deep in the saddle, the length of time they bucked was not measured in seconds. In fact, it was not measured, but it usually lasted several minutes. These were not modern-day rodeo horses. They were mean. Biting, striking, falling, and rolling were all in the order of attempt to not just unseat the rider, but to kill him. Now, Dode Smith and Lanny long lived through several weeks of this torturous treatment, collected their money when the job was finished, and considered themselves well paid. They had only ridden the animals this one time. Normally it took months to make horses like that rideable, and then they could never be trusted. A wary eye had to be kept constantly open. If any of them ever actually ended up with Teddy Roosevelt, his boys had to do some real rough riding just to stay aboard. Next chapter, titled History of Sam Shaw's Place. Now, Claude J. Williams came up to Madeline Plains from Chico. He was no relation to John Williams or the South Fork Williams clan. He came in the late 80s and filed on those little springs that Sam Shaw had filed on several years before. Evidently, everybody else had been afraid to touch that piece of land after the hair-raising happenings involved with it. Williams took it up as a preemption claim of 40 acres. He later acquired another 320 acres to go along with it. Claude Williams was married and had a couple of children who attended school at the Point for several years. They lived in a small cabin that he had built on the place. Claude made a living by running a few cattle and horses. He had better luck with the piece of property than poor old Sam Shaw had, but everything did not go just right for him either. He got the patent for his land from the U.S. government on January 17, 1891, and lost it on February 20, 1896. Borrowing money had caused the loss. He borrowed $1,000 from Elmer Van Loan in 1894 and signed over a mortgage to the place. He also borrowed money from Abe Triplett, and Abe got a similar mortgage, but when Van Loan finally took the case to court to collect the money, he had the first mortgage and obtained a judgment against Williams for $1,247.36. The property was put up for sale at a public auction at the courthouse in Susanville on September 19, 1896. Elmer Van Loan was the sole bidder, and he got the entire 360 acres for $1,000. Dick Clampett was an old bachelor, 50 years old at the time he bought the place. He did a little farming of his own, but mainly worked out for another ranch. His luck went sour, too, before he sold out and left. He fell in love with Eppa Williams and decided she should marry him. She had different ideas about the matter, however. After all, Dick was almost 40 years older than she was. Besides, she had taken a liking to flashy young Tom Kaufman. Poor old Clampett almost lost his mind over the loss. He hit the bottle pretty hard after that, and spent most of his time weeping and wailing to whoever would listen to him. He sold the Shaw place to George R. Templeton of Woodland on June 11th, 1900. He also increased the price of the 360 acres to $2,000. George Templeton was married to the former Dora Waldevogel. She had a daughter, Etha Waldevogel. Since Eltha was George's stepdaughter, however, everyone knew her as Eltha Templeton. The Templetons did the first real farming on the place. George cleared a lot of land and fenced the place. He acquired more land, bringing his total holdings to 600 acres. He planted all of the land that was farmable into wheat, but mostly he just ran a lot of cattle. After 5 years, the Templetons sold the place to the Tule Lake Land and Irrigation Company and moved to Ash Valley. Next chapter, titled Termo, the Arrival of the NC&O. Page 107.